Friends, shall we mourn here deedless forever, a shadow folk mist-haunting, dropping vain tears in the thankless sea? Or shall we continue our analysis of the Quenta Silmarillion with Chapter 2 of Aulë and Yavanna? I think you know what the answer is. First, a quick explanation for people who are encountering this maybe for the first time. As part of the extra audio that goes out on my Patreon page, I've been going through the Silmarillion chapter by chapter, doing kind of a deep dive on each one, giving my thoughts as I go. And I've been breaking it down into what actually happens in this chapter in terms of the plot, including any connections to the earlier or later events of the story. I try and get an overview of how each chapter evolved in the course of Tolkien's thought throughout multiple decades of writing. And then I see what themes I can pick out, what motifs show up or suggest themselves, and what elements make up the aesthetic achievement of the Silmarillion as a whole. Today brings us to Chapter 2 of the Quenta Silmarillion, titled Of Aulë and Yavanna, which is a very short selection. It only takes up 4 pages in my copy, and really there's only 2, maybe 2.5 things that happen. Which is quite the contrast with the previous chapter of the Beginning of Days, which described a lot of very complicated and earth-shattering things happening over the course of a time span that's so broad it's difficult for mortal minds to conceive. Starting with the Valar's entrance into Arda, taking us through several conflicts with Melkor, and ending with the establishment of the land of Valinor on the continent of Aman, the world being shaped more or less to the form that the first elves would find it in, and the creation of the 2 trees of Valinor. And after all this, the Valar enter kind of a period of stasis. They're awaiting the awakening of the elves, who will be the first of Eru's children, and up north, Morgoth is making preparations of his own, but the catch here is that no one really knows when the elves are going to awaken. They know it's coming relatively soon, but in the meantime, they're kind of stuck. And when this chapter opens, it appears that the waiting around has started getting to at least one of the Valar, Aulë, who is the Vala of Earth, but also the Lord of Craft. He takes delight in teaching, and so far there's really no one for him to teach. So he gets impatient, and in secret he tries to make little people of his own, which turn out to be the Dwarves. He makes them very stout and tough and difficult to dominate. He also, for some reason, makes them all bearded. And just as he's wrapping up and getting ready to instruct them in a language he made for them, Eru Ilúvatar himself speaks to Aulë and says, "You know that you've just succeeded in creating little soulless automatons that don't have the true spark of life. You know that, right? And was that really what you wanted? Was that really your desire?" And Aulë, to his credit, has this sort of horrified realization and immediately says, "No, that's not what I wanted at all. I wanted things that were different from me so that I would have something to teach and something to love." And he goes on to make a very good, succinct case for the value of erring on the side of excessive subcreation, as it were. He compares himself to a child copying his father, not to make fun of him, but because he wants to be like him and emulate him. But then he says, "Look, I recognize that clearly I overreached here, maybe I should just scrap the whole project." And he lifts up his hammer to crush the dwarves, and in that moment they flinch away from him, they fall down pleading for mercy, and Ilúvatar says, "Look, I made it so that they're alive now. They can want things that are different from what you want." And Aulë is super pleased about this, but Eru does have some terms and conditions. He says that he's not going to make any more changes or improvements to Aulë's design other than bringing them to life. So whatever flaws Aulë may have left in them are there to stay. And secondly, Ilúvatar says they can't be out walking around until it's time for the children to be awake as Eru planned. So Aulë lays them in various places throughout Middle-earth to sleep until the elves come. And then finally, Ilúvatar foretells that dwarves and elves will have a hard time getting along. Shortly after this, Aulë finally opens up to somebody about the dwarf project. He tells his wife, Yavanna, what happened, and honestly, she seems a little bit jelly. But moreover, she becomes worried about her creations, the plants and the animals, and kind of the living natural world. So she goes to Manwë, and she doesn't tell him about the dwarves, but she does say, "Look, I'm a little concerned that when the children arrive," nice and vague there, "they're going to abuse my creations." She says trees in particular are going to be really vulnerable to that. Manwë replies, well, okay, you should have known that already. That was part of the song. And she says, yes, but there was another part in the song that you're forgetting, and that was my desire that the trees themselves might be able to defend themselves somehow. So Manwë's kind of thrown by this. He goes off to consider it. He communes with Eru a bit, and he sees the vision of Arda again. But this time it's more like he's within it, and he notices a bunch of things he apparently missed the first time. It's like he's seeing them in a different light now. So he reports back to Yavanna, hey, guess what? You were right. Once the children wake up, spirits are going to come inhabit the trees and defend the woods, and that is how that thought of yours is going to be expressed. And he says, what's more, in the meantime, your thought and my thought are combining in weird ways now that we're within the story of Arda, and we're going to be getting the Great Eagles. So he and Yavanna are both super stoked, they high-five, and Yavanna flounces back to Aulë and says, guess what, Manwë says I get my own humanoid race too, so yeah. And Aulë says, well, the dwarves are still gonna need wood, and goes back to his work. Because little known fact, Aulë is also Lord of the One-Liner. And that's it. That is the end of the chapter. Like I said, pretty much two things happen. Aulë creates the dwarves, and Yavanna and Manwë learn about the soon-to-arrive eagles and Ents. As far as how this chapter itself impacts the overall plot of the Silmarillion, the short answer is that to a surprising degree it doesn't. The dwarves themselves do affect the plot of the Silmarillion at multiple points. They've been there since the beginning, and they've played limited but critical roles in the history of the First Age ever since the very earliest versions of it were set down. But the specific account of their origins doesn't really affect those roles very much. We do know that technically for a very brief time, the dwarves were awakened and given some kind of life before the elves arrive, so they have some kind of claim to being the actual eldest of the children of Iluvatar to arrive in the world. But of course, they're put into some kind of stasis before they can really do anything, and they only awaken supposedly after the elves have awoken. Also of note is that, as we are shortly to see, probably in excruciating detail, the elves all sort of awaken in a centralized location that's right in the middle of everything, and they spread out from that single point. The dwarves are scattered or kind of seeded throughout Arda at different points, so from the very beginning, they're dispersed throughout Arda. You could say something similar about the Eagles, of course. They play a bunch of important roles, and it's nice to know something about when they showed up and what their origin is supposed to be in this version. But again, that knowledge doesn't really impact the kinds of roles that they play. And then finally, there's the Ents, which theoretically would have existed in Beleriand during the First Age. It sounds like Treebeard knows the territory pretty well. But apart from the possibility that maybe Ents helped Beren fight the dwarves of Nogrod after they sacked Doriath, they really don't do much of the Silmarillion. I don't know that they're even mentioned again. And that's kind of to be expected given that Tolkien only invented them after he'd pretty much figured out the history of the First Age. The Ents were definitely a later addition to this universe. Now, as for the way this chapter evolved over the years, many of you will remember my angst about trying to navigate history of Middle-earth and related publications. I took a whole recording session to explain my plan to match up the different versions, and then finally I was able to apply that framework more or less successfully to Chapter 1 of The Beginning of Days, which is more or less stable across all the different eras and versions of the so-called Silmarillion. In Chapter 2, I've had to totally abandon that framework because this chapter as such does not actually exist anywhere but in the published Silmarillion. So the text itself is Tolkienian, but the chapter and its placement is an editorial construction. So the first half of the chapter, which is the account of Aulë's creation of the dwarves, is sourced mainly from a section that appears in the later Quenta Silmarillion around Chapter 10, so at the point where our fictional narrator or chronicler is explaining how the Noldor established their realms in Beleriand, and particularly how Caranthir's people encountered dwarves for the first time in the Arid Luin. And Tolkien stops midstream, as it were, to write out kind of a little separated out section titled Of the Naugrim and the Edain, which pretty much includes the story as published in Chapter 2. The editors plucked that out, it looks like, and stuck it in here between the accounts of the shaping of Arda itself and the beginning of recorded history and the actual arrival of the elves and things starting to really get underway. So more or less where it would belong chronologically. Now, as for the idea itself that the dwarves were originally created by Aulë and then imbued with the spark of true being when Iluvatar adopted them as a sort of mercy or favor to Aulë, you can watch that emerge and evolve in successive texts. And luckily for me, I had hunted down a lot of those references to dwarves almost a year ago now when I was working on a video about the origins of the orcs. When dwarves first make an appearance, no one within the framework of the narrative really knows where they came from. They're said to be very like the creations of Morgoth, so, pretty much goblins, orcs, balrogs, that kind of thing. But it's noted that they serve neither Morgoth nor the Valar. That state of affairs more or less persists throughout the Sketch of the Mythology, the Quenta Noldorinwa, and into the early annals of Beleriand, although they do get introduced at different points in the narrative and start to play more positive roles, collaborating with the elves more often, contributing smithcraft to the Union of Mithros, that kind of thing. Finally, in the later annals of Beleriand, so around the late 30s, the kind of last deep breath before the plunge into writing The Lord of the Rings, the narrator or chronicler, Pengoloth, breaks the fourth wall and comes into the narrative to say, it is said by some of the wise in Valinor, as I have since learned, that Aulë made the dwarves long ago, but the dwarves have no spirit indwelling, as have the children of the Creator, and they have skill but not art, and they go back into the stone of the mountains of which they were made. And then there's a later revision to this that says that the bit about them not having an indwelling spirit and returning to stone after they die, that's actually just an Oldoran belief, and there are others who believe that Aulë looks after them and Iluvatar somehow has accepted them on his behalf. And that's part of a larger trend that we see a lot, particularly with regard to the dwarves. A lot of equivocating and comments like, well, the elves claim this, but wise elves claim something different, and the dwarves themselves actually either don't comment or they say something totally different. So it shakes out to be a lot of priming, I guess, for the idea that we should really be taking the narrative framing into account here. Almost like a move to preemptively buffer or mitigate the possible biases of the recorders. Chris Tolkien also observes that from this point, you can see this concept of the origin of the dwarves starts to maybe influence descriptions of Aulë that are found in later versions of the Ainulindalë and the writings that would eventually be the Valaquenta. So earlier on in the Silmarillion, we read that Melkor and Aulë share a particular desire to bring forth new things, and that drive to be original and bring new things into being that they have in common gets more emphasis after Tolkien kind of nails down this idea that the dwarves were created by Aulë. You can also detect traces of this story and connections to it in, for instance, the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, in the section titled Durin's Folk in particular. Another place is in material that was drafted as part of the writing of letter, I think it's to 11, that was apparently never sent, and there we get a slightly different account or record of the supposed dialogue between Iluvatar and Aulë. But on the whole, Tolkien was very reticent about giving out too many details about this story. Like I said, it looks like he never did send the material that he drafted describing the origins of the dwarves. There's also a relatively late interview where he's starting to comment on this idea that the dwarves were a product of one of the Valar rather than belonging to Eru's planned children, the elves and men, but he cuts himself off and he says something like, well, it'll all come out when I published the Silmarillion, but I don't think I'll say any more about the dwarves just now. Basically, that the story is there, but he doesn't want to share the details publicly. So even with this relatively fully developed story that he hasn't rejected, and that he's now kind of reflecting in the published materials, he's still got a hesitation about really committing to it. He's still adjusting it as he goes. He's not entirely settled on the matter. And when you look at the work that he's doing around this time with other related matters like the orcs and the Ents and the eagles, it all starts to make sense. It's kind of like last chapter with the shaping of Arda. As Tolkien proceeds on, he seems to have this increasing conviction that he's got to get the details of these foundational matters and assumptions right, and if he doesn't, then the whole project loses something as a result. And at times it seems like he was willing and contemplating sacrificing quite a lot for the sake of a more consistent foundation. Now, as for the second half of this chapter and the matter of the Ents, we know fairly certainly that Tolkien invented the Ents more or less spontaneously during the composition of The Lord of the Rings. So the dwarves had always been part of the legendarium, and the conception of them and their possible origins was what evolved and emerged over time. The Ents did not exist in material written before The Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien actually had a bit of a job figuring out how they would fit in. So the second half of this chapter of the published Silmarillion, Chapter 2, is essentially a near paraphrase of an essay written no earlier than 1958 or 59, but Christopher Tolkien notes it could easily have been written much later than that. I believe the title is Quenya for, of the Ents and the Eagles. It's an essay about the Ents and the Eagles. And what's kind of funny about that is that he's lumping the eagles in with this attempt to explain the Ents. And the eagles of Manwë, and really for that matter, the idea of talking or intelligent animals, just generally, have been a part of Middle-earth since the very beginning. And they've persisted through The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But in this essay, he's trying to solve the problem of their existence and their origins, along with the Ents that kind of popped up out of nowhere. In the version that makes it into the Silmarillion, Manwë determines that the Ents, and also his great eagles, were present in the music, but they weren't really recognized as such. During his contemplation, he perceives that ideas that the Valar would all recognize as having been included in the great theme may have an expression within Arda that they didn't foresee. And that is a really conveniently flexible explanation for potentially a lot of weird little seeming anomalies in Middle-earth. It also, I think, kind of helps explain the limitations on the knowledge of the Valar. Because on the one hand, they're these tremendously wise, nearly divine beings of great power, and more so of great knowledge and awareness. Not only did they sort of set up the conditions of the world, but then they were granted a vision of how it would mostly play out. But then, on the other hand, we know they're not omniscient. There are things that are hidden from them, there are things that have changed from the original pattern, and there's also just things that they didn't notice or didn't perceive the same way outside of Arda as they do now that they're within it. So it kind of helps contextualize, I think, the limitations on their knowledge, and basically why they do have debates and make bad calls and miss sometimes seemingly very obvious signs. There is, though, a letter from 1963 which is contrary to this idea of the Ents having been an unrecognized or unforeseen expression of a theme within the music of the Ainur. And here Tolkien says that it was believed the Ents were not in the music of the Ainur. This is interesting because the dwarves definitely weren't in the music, or at least they shouldn't have been. And with the Ents, whether you're considering them as part of the music or as something else, in both cases there's this latent idea that the Ents were meant to be a reaction to, or maybe a correction for, the dwarves. So in that letter from 63, which of course in typical Tolkienian fashion starts trailing off into illegibility right at the point it starts to get interesting, we get this mention that the Ents were given power over stone, kind of as though that power or gift was connected in some way to their origin. And in The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits describe how Ents can tear up stone like it's a crust of bread, even the stones of Isengard. I think it's Merry talking about it. He says their fingers just freeze on it and then they rip it up. Now, I figured this was just one of their exaggeratedly tree-ish traits, because if it's left to its own devices, a tree will wreak absolute havoc on stone, concrete, sidewalks, foundations, anything like that. The roots will just eventually get right through it. They'll gradually grow and push their way through just about anything. So I figured with the Ents we were seeing just sort of a sped up version of this property. But it actually looks like it could be something more metaphysical than that. After all, Yavanna's big concern is that her creations are going to be destroyed, and Aulë and Manwë both point out to her that this was part of the plan all along. It's not necessarily a bad thing, and according to the plan, the children of Eru are supposed to be grateful and respectful for Yavanna's gifts, the natural resources that they use. And Yavanna makes a couple of counterpoints. First to Aulë, she says that the dwarves were made by him alone, and that he kept them from her thought and her influence during their creation, and so they are going to lack a lot of the innate respect for living and growing things, since he only made them from his own mind and not in collaboration with the ideas of others. She also makes the point that Melkor has already marred and ruined a lot of what was part of the original plan, and if he darkens the hearts of the children, then they too might well become wasteful and careless when it comes to using the resources of nature. And actually, in that original version of the essay about Ents and Eagles, Yavanna says that she's even noticed this kind of attitude, particularly with regard to trees, among the Ainur. So the function of the Ents is to counteract these problems. And remember, the Ents are the expression of Yavanna's wish that the woods could defend themselves with wrath if necessary. And that, to me, is not the kind of thing I would suppose would be necessary in Arda Unmarred. If everyone is using the trees properly and participating in good forestry management, then why would the woods need wrathful defenders? So, assuming that the seeds of the idea of Ents did indeed exist in the music, it still seems that the way they end up entering Arda is under very different circumstances than what might have first been envisioned. So it's no wonder that Manwë is a little thrown by the idea of it. Thematically, this chapter is doing a lot of work with the idea of subcreation and all the potential permutations thereof. Creativity and subcreation and artistry are tremendous themes in Middle-earth. They really kind of get looked at and picked apart from every angle. But in this chapter, something that I think is of note is that we're really seeing some of the limits of subcreation, not just the limits of what might be possible, but also the ethical limits and the idea of what responsibilities a creator or an artist might have for their work. Generally, Tolkien is quite adamant that subcreation is a human right, that human creativity is a trait by which human nature can share something with divine nature, and that not only is it not forbidden or discouraged, it's actually, in his view, I would say, encouraged to take those creative faculties more to their extremes and envision realities and worlds that are in some way contrary to or opposed to the nature of primary reality and your observations and beliefs about it. I think there's maybe even a whiff of that in his irritation with the idea that The Lord of the Rings is allegorical. You know, this renouncing of the idea that a work of art like the one he had attempted to make could have a single meaning that was entirely the responsibility of the author. He preferred the idea that the novel was applicable, that it had applicability to a bunch of different scenarios, including maybe to ones that he hadn't even consciously figured out. So even, the meaning of his own novel, he always seemed a little irritable when people seemed to think that he would be responsible for determining that. I think this chapter is one of those places where we see the other side of that. This awareness that the human power of subcreation that he was so passionate about could also bear a certain responsibility or be vulnerable to misuse. It's also interesting, though, that these acts of transgression or near transgression do seem to end up beautifying and defoliating Arda in the end. The only other thing that I want to say about this chapter is that it fills a gap that I feel when considering the Silmarillion as a myth or a mythology rather than as, say, like a cycle of legends. It's really the only occasion we have within the narrative to see domestic life in Valinor among the gods / Valar without the elves kind of taking the spotlight. We've seen them being all sweeping and majestic, shaping the very nature and forces of the earth itself and doing titanic battle with each other, being very godly, in other words. But by design, when the elves show up, and then even more so when men show up, the Valar get less and less involved with the affairs of Middle-earth, or at least less directly, less actively involved. We really don't get to see them going on the kind of more minor adventures or even like the more humorous stories that tend to turn up in naturally occurring mythologies. There's no marital dramas, very little at this point in the way of children. There's none of the smaller origin stories or the just so stories about, why the leopard has spots or why we use this particular species of reed to make all of our woodwind instruments, who taught the spiders to weave webs, nothing about, the birth of Huan or the day Orome found Nahar. This bit with Aulë and Yavanna each adding their respective codas to the theme, I guess, is really the closest to that we get in the Silmarillion. I know in looking at other chapters, I'd mentioned that to me it looks like sibling relationships among the Valar represent a kind of duality, whereas the marriages between the different Valar represent more complementarity, like the union of ideas that seem to contain an opposition or a tension, but are also connected and kind of depend on each other. And that's very much the case with Aulë and Yavanna, who represent the earth as a resource to be used on the one hand, and nature as a cyclical, self-perpetuating system on the other hand. And it's neat to see in this episode the two of them having a little spat or this mild degree of friction that they're resolving. As brief as it is, it's a neat glimpse at how that dynamic plays out interpersonally, letting us see the Valar less as abstract personifications of natural forces and more like people, like characters with personalities, sort of the same basic kind of being as elves and men and now presumably dwarves and even Ents, although of a somewhat different nature and a higher dignity and power. I also very much just personally enjoy the fact that Manwe and Yavanna seem to be buddies, that they've made some especially significant collaborations in the past, and they kind of seem to enjoy working together. It's a relationship that, in my opinion, appears to be reflected in their respective spouses with Aulë and Varda. I think it's neat to see Yavanna invoking the memory of the things that they sang about together during the great music, and trusting him enough to share this pretty radical-sounding idea with him. And it does actually seem to make him a little nervous, but he does her the service of entertaining it seriously. He goes off to contemplate it. He gets kind of enlightened, and then he seems so happy that he's able to bring her good news, and then they're both just so stoked about the eagles. And Manwe does point out that even Yavanna's trees are not going to be tall enough for them to nest in, that they are going to end up nesting in Aulë's mountains, but they still have this delight in the fact that Manwe's winds will be rushing through the boughs of Yavanna's trees, and the little birds are going to make nests in the trees but then go fly in the air. It's all terribly wholesome, and it's one of the reasons why I find it difficult to hate Manwe in particular. In this pre-elf period, he's kind of the den leader of a troop of Cub Scouts. They're all just trying to explore the world and do the right thing and earn their badges. So with that, we will put a bow on Chapter 2. Next up, in Chapter 3, we will finally get some elves and all of the delightful drama that will entail. Let me know if you are more than ready for that, or maybe if you would prefer to have enjoyed more littler stories about the Valar like the ones that we kind of get in this chapter. Thank you to everyone for listening, and until next chapter, be safe and be well.